Hello Duelist, I am back with another video here. The other day I put out a video about cards that you could add to your Orcust deck to improve it. Today I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to talk about cards that you could add to your deck that would counter Orcust. There's a lot of them. Here I want to talk about ones that are kind of specific to Orcust and not too generic. An example of that would be what I have on screen here, Forbidden Chalice, where you can stop a card from using its effect where Scrap Recycler or something like Phantom Skyblaster, they bring out, you put this and they can't kind of chain summon into Orcust, but because it's a little bit generic, I'm not including it in the list, but at least shouting it out here. So I'll jump into the list that I have. First off is Chaos Hunter. This isn't the most common card, but I think it is an interesting one to mention. So it's a hand trap. You can special summon it from your hand when your opponent special summons a monster by discarding one card. So if you're playing a deck that benefits from getting cards, especially monsters, to the graveyard, could be a good fit there. And while it is on the field, your opponent cannot banish cards. So obviously that is the big benefit there. They cannot activate Orcust effects for monsters in the graveyard. So one to consider there, and especially if it fits with the deck that you're playing. One to check out. Next up, we have Artifact Lancia. You can tribute this card from your hand, and neither player can banish cards from their graveyard for the rest of this turn. So really, if you know that your opponent's playing Orcust and they're getting ready to do that chain, you play this card and they can't banish anything. The downside is that it only lasts for one turn, so you have to have it in your hand, and hopefully, if your opponent has to answer or end their turn and it is then your turn, you can take advantage of the fact that they weren't able to bring their proper monsters out by activating effects in the graveyard, because next turn they can go back to doing it, so you really need to take advantage of it. But it is super powerful. This does see a lot of play right now, and I think of the cards in this list, this is seeing the most play and can work pretty diversely in a number of different decks there. Next one up is a little bit similar to Artifact Lancia, is DD Crow. Another hand trap, you can discard the card to the graveyard and target one card in the opponent's graveyard and banish it. So for example, if your opponent is going to use a card effect, you can kind of use this and counter it basically. So like if they have Harpor in their graveyard and they summon a card, you play this and then you can banish that before it's able to activate the effect. Now the downside here is pretty clear, you can only do it for one card. Very commonly with Orcust, your opponent just has a loaded graveyard, and as much as you can stop one card, you can't stop them all. So definitely a strong card, but has limitations there. Next up is the true double-edged sword here. We have Necro Valley, so cards in the graveyard cannot be banished. You will note that this is applying to both players. So if you're playing a deck where you don't really need to access your graveyard, it's a great fit. However, there's not a ton of those right now, so you're going to hurt yourself just as much as your opponent by playing this card. You could have it in your deck, maybe one of them, and if you were to draw it, you only play it if you think it's in effect. If you think you're playing against an Orcust deck, something to consider. But yeah, double-edged sword for sure, and you're not going to really want to play a purely Necro Valley deck right now. They're just not viable, despite you having an advantage over a lot of other decks that are really going to require that graveyard. But regardless, Necro Valley is something that I should mention on the list here. This one is really interesting. It is a spell card and it's not quick play, so you have to activate it during your turn, but by paying 1,000 life points, you can banish all machine-type monsters your opponent controls in their graveyard. That's a lot. Orcust can take cards from banished and put them back in the deck, back to the field, back in your hand, anything like that. But wiping their whole field and graveyard for the cost of only 1,000 life points, which is really not a lot. Same thing as kind of Cosmic Cyclone right now, which is seeing a ton of play. So trading 1,000 life points for essentially locking your opponent out of like all of their effect monsters is really powerful. It's just you have to have the right timing for it, and your opponent already has to have kind of a stacked field and graveyard to pull it off there. But a very, very powerful option. And the next one here is a really, really solid one too. Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. I've seen this work really effectively. Negate all dark monster effects activated on the field or in the graveyard. Orcust monsters are dark type. This can work really, really well. And locking them out. I mean, the only downside really here is it's taking up a spell or trap zone on your field and can work as a target. Those cards are going to have, or those decks are going to have Nightmare Phoenix. They can pick it off. They're going to have probably Cosmic Cyclone. They can pick it off, but for as long as it's active on the field, you're going to be dominating there, and you're probably not going to want to play more than one of this card. You're probably not going to want to play more of than one of any of these cards. Maybe Artifact Lancia, or if you're really going Necro Valley, you could do that way. But, you know, if you can pull this off, it would be really strong. So those are 6 cards, but of course, I have to give you a little bit of bonus. I'm going to click into Sealed Tombs here, because a lot of people are playing it with the Shizu specifically. So if your life points are 1,000 or lower, then your opponent, until the end, when you activate it until the end of your opponent's next turn, neither player can banish cards from the graveyard or special summon monsters from the graveyard. So you're locking down any of the effects going off there, and as much as only one turn, you know, we are seeing so many duels right now end within one turn, whether it is just due to surrender of like not being able to do anything, or you just being able to take advantage of the fact that your opponent can't do anything. So that could, you know, that skill alone could be the difference in the duel. And you know, even again, if you're playing Orcust, you can use Sealed Tombs and take advantage of your opponent there, just depending on the timing. So those are 6 cards that you can use as +1 skill to counter Orcust.